design, marriage, family, child rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We're going to spend some time in this first hour looking at some of the rhetoric that's being used right now. In particular, I'm going to focus on this idea of trying to completely eliminate ICE and what that might mean and some of the reaction to that. Also, some commentaries about so many individuals using the image of Nazis, of concentration camps, and what that might mean as well. Spend just a little bit of time on that. And then I also want to look ahead to a decision that will come down, no doubt, next Monday. And we're already hearing lots of rumors about who President Donald Trump might actually put on the court. And in particular, lots of very harsh things being said about Amy Coney Barrett. And that really, if nothing else, illustrates kind of this anti-religious liberty theme that has been working our way through the conventional wisdom of many people in the media, especially those in the academy. And so those are just a few topics we'll address. Dr. Barry Kramer will be in studio with us next hour. He's the president of Criswell College. We'll kind of continue our conversation about religious liberty. One of the articles we've posted by our good friend Robert Knight, Are You Tired of Winning Yet?, in which he kind of recounts some of the decisions that have come down. Thought it would be good to hear Dr. Kramer talking about that in terms of what he thinks, how Christians should address this issue of religious liberty, what he thinks about some of the Supreme Court decisions, immigration, and the rest. And then the last hour, if you would like to join us, it is not on the local stations here, but it is still a broadcast that we do for our national audience. And that is Sergey Rakhuba will be with us, and he is the president of Mission Eurasia, and they have had just a phenomenal outreach at the World Cup. Now, I know a lot of you probably don't watch soccer the way I do. I mean, pretty fascinating yesterday to watch Belgium in the very last minutes actually defeat Japan and some of the other particular very important cases, Brazil and Mexico and all the rest. And so I sort of paid attention to it. But whether you watch World Cup or not, most people around the world do. And lots of them have come to Russia to watch these various venues. And this has just become a great opportunity to proclaim the gospel. So we're going to be talking about that as well. And then get you ready for the 4th of July, because after all, that's tomorrow. Tomorrow will be a tape program. And I always try to tell people that even though it's a tape program, we always pick some of the best. So it is sometimes, I think, a little unfortunate that when we do have a holiday, we play a tape program, which I would like to play on a day when we know more people might be listening, because there's some great material in the 3 hours we will cover tomorrow. And, of course, my commentary tomorrow is on the Declaration of Independence. So just a lot of things for you to look forward to, and I hope you have a safe and enjoyable 4th of July. Let's get into some of this. Jim Garrity, for example, asks a very good question. Do Democrats really want to enforce immigration laws? Because if you have not seen the posters, and I don't see how you could have avoided them unless you don't watch television or don't open up a newspaper, you see all these signs that say abolish ICE, or some of them say ICE is a state-sponsored terrorist organization. Here is one picture on this particular article that goes into that. And he says one of the reasons we should be wary of the call by some of these radical Democrats to abolish ICE is to recognize that even if you believe that the family separation policy is a bad idea, obviously is, but even if you accept that and believe that the federal government should be punished for decisions that have been made in the past by people other than Donald Trump, This, as we've talked about in this program before, refers to the Flores Consent Decree. It has to do with the William Wilberforce law that was passed under George W. Bush by Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats. It has to do with decisions that were made about whether or not to have catch and release or zero tolerance. But nevertheless, he points out that even if you are convinced that the family policy issue is so awful that we have to abolish ICE, you might want to understand that there's really only one agency out of 4 that's actually playing that role. And you could even say 5 if you count the Department of Defense, because after all, they're building tents at Fort Bliss and at the Air Force Base in Texas called Goodfellow. So you're talking about a lot more than ICE, which stands again for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Here's an article that I think illustrates this only so well. Families that cross the border illegally or turn themselves in at ports of entry in hope of gaining asylum typically encounter the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the law's law enforcement agency. So that's number 1. Under the Trump administration's zero tolerance policy, adults who cross into it between ports are then transferred to the custody of the U.S. Marshals. That would be number 2 in the Department of Justice. Then they're bused to federal courts across the border. Once they're prosecuted, then adults are sent to number 3. That would be U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and one of the several agencies under the umbrella of the Department of Homeland Security. The agency oversees all sorts of different detention centers and the rest. And then under the family separation policy, children are held at the border and handed over to what? Number 4, the Department of Health and Human Services, where they become part of the unaccompanied minors held under the program. So, as Jim Garrity says, in other words, it's the U.S. Border Patrol that does the separating, the Department of Justice that does the prosecuting, ICE holds the adults and prepares them for deportation, then deports them, and HHS handles the care of the children while the adults are being detained, or in many cases when there weren't adults with them in the first place. Notice which agency is attracting the most ire from the left, and that is, of course, the one that prepares them for deportation. And again, if you see this, one of the attempts lately by some of these more radical leaders to tamp down this a little bit, you see on USA Today, the newspaper I receive every day at my home, the attorney, Paul Reyes, lists the allegations of abuse, of mismanagement, and declares that no one is calling for a halt in immigration enforcement. Either ICE needs to do it in a more humane way with greater oversight, or the reassigned to other agencies. But I love what Jim Garrity says. But I noticed that liberal protesters aren't chanting reform ICE, or reassign the duties to other agencies, reassign the duties to other agencies. What are they saying? Well, they're actually saying abolish ICE. So you can see the problem. When we come back from the break, what we're going to do is talk about the number of protests that have come out rather dramatically. But this thing has caught fire, and now there is a Democrat leader in the House of Representatives that actually has drafted an abolish ICE bill. And what it would do is, but there is a problem. This is the executive branch, and you can't cut executive branch leadership out of the management of an executive branch agency. Let me use small words so that some of them will understand. It's in the Constitution. The executive branch has to administer the executive branch. You can't create a commission to actually oversee the executive branch. It's called Constitution 101. And again, if you need any more information, we even have a copy of the Constitution, and you can look at Article 2 in the Constitution and know that what this is being proposed in the bill makes 0 sense and will be declared unconstitutional. We'll be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The Starbucks CEO announced that he was going to close down 150 stores. The argument given by the company was that these stores were hit with declining sales. While that may be true, economists have noticed another reason why these stores may be closing. According to an article by Brandon Morse, the first stores on the chopping block are those located in cities where the Fight for 15 crowd has had their victories. If you're not familiar with the movement, they are activists who have been fighting to increase the starting wage to $15 per hour. The Fight for 15 began in 2012 when 200 fast food workers walked off their job in New York City. In his statement, Starbucks CEO Kevin Johnson didn't mention the $15 per hour issue directly, but you can read between the lines. He said that he was closing the stores in the major metro areas where increases in wages and occupancy and other regulatory requirements make Starbucks stores unprofitable. Yes, that would be those places with high minimum wage hikes and additional regulatory burdens. Usually find them in blue cities and in blue states. It's worth noting that while he is planning on closing many of these urban stores, he's also planning on opening Starbucks stores in less regulated suburban stores. So far, the Fight for 15 activists haven't been as successful in those venues. This isn't the first time I've talked about the impact of raising the minimum wage on businesses. We've seen the negative impact on all businesses in the Seattle area. We've even seen the impact nationwide on some businesses like Chipotle and Red Robin. If you raise the cost of labor in a business with small margins, it can become unprofitable and eventually go out of business. Starbucks is finding it hard to make a profit when activists force you to pay more than your business model would allow. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. The question on the table, should we abolish ICE, which again stands for the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency? That's certainly the argument being used right now. And in case you think that this has not begun to catch hold, this comes from the Daily Caller. And again, this happened Monday night or early Tuesday morning. It's hard to tell exactly where, but vandals threw a brick through the window of the Republican Party headquarters in Lincoln, Nebraska, and next to it was a spray-painted message, "Abolish ICE." Now, how throwing a brick through the Republican headquarters there and abolish ICE, how that connects really almost as incidental to individuals who are now convinced that they have an issue to run on in not only the campaigns, but an issue to bring people to the streets. And just to give you an illustration of that, let's go to a couple of other places. I gave you Nebraska, Lincoln, Nebraska. Let's go to San Francisco, California. Demonstrators pitched 5 tents and a small pavilion and a section of chain link fence with barbed wire outside San Francisco's U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services office last night. In Portland, Oregon, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement spokesman said that the agency's Portland headquarters will resume normal operations today, but they were closed on June 20th after protesters upset with Donald Trump's immigration policies blocked the entrances to the facility. No word, since it's still early there, whether or not they decided to block them today. Let's head to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Establishing a small encampment, I'm reading from a news article here, establishing a small encampment for a prolonged occupation. Several hundred protesters gathered late last night and yesterday afternoon outside the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Office in Center City to demand an end to that policy and cooperation between the city of Philadelphia and ICE. And the protesters are still there this morning. And then one more, just real quickly, Hartford, Connecticut. Again, reading from a news story, nearly 500 people participated in the protest, including clergy and the American Civil Liberties Union, of course. And these were individuals in an act of civil disobedience, actually tried to shut down the ICE office on Main Street for the day by blocking the entrance, just like what has been happening in Portland, Oregon. And so far, the Hartford police have arrested 35 people, and this is a couple of hours ago, so I don't know what the numbers are now. That just gives you a little bit of a feel for what's going on around the country. Now, is this a winning idea for our Democratic candidates? Maybe not. The Huffington Post did a survey. Now, again, let's be honest that sometimes organizations that already have a bias might not necessarily always be the most objective standard. So when we talk about the Huffington Post, we're not necessarily talking about Gallup poll or Rasmussen, but okay, we'll concede what we've got. And the Huffington Post put the question of abolishing ICE before a polling sample and telling its readers the answer they probably didn't want to hear. They found, and this is the Huffington Post, that just 21% of the respondents said they support abolishing ICE, while 44% said they oppose it, and, as no surprise, since 35% were undecided. So nearly 3 in 10 Americans polled said they strongly oppose the idea. So it isn't just that we think that this is not a good idea. We think this is a really bad idea. And again, as I pointed out just a minute ago, you have a member of the House of Representatives, Democrat, who is drafting what's called an abolish ICE anything. Instead, it would create a commission to run ICE rather than the executive branch, which, as I mentioned a minute ago, is a problem that would run right in the face of and against the ideas found in the U.S. Constitution. And even apart from the obvious flaw, Jim Garrity says the commission would have to wait for the direction from Congress to act. And as he, I think, wisely points out, you can't cut the executive branch leadership out of the management of the executive branch agency. It's called Article 2 of the Constitution. And if you need to, go back and look at your history book, 1787, 1788 will help you out on that. Let's, as we're talking about the border issues, recognize that this could go from bad to worse. I haven't said anything about the election in Mexico, and it's just one of those things where I wish we even brought it up on Friday, but since everything was religious, I didn't get into it. But I've been following not on the air, but certainly on my own, the campaign and now the election of Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. Now, he is an individual that is, of course, going to be our new president in Mexico. And he, of course, is known mostly by his acronym, which is AMLO, AMLO, or sort of like uh-oh. And that's a good way to remember him because uh-oh has said, well, he's giving us all these assurances that they'll have a respectful and cooperative relationship with the United States. But that seems unlikely. People that know him, have followed his career, Hispanic friends and even broadcasters I've been paying attention to say that if anything, we now have the president of Mexico who is really a radical leftist, kind of in the mold of Venezuela's Hugo Chavez. And so as a result, I think we're going to have more problems because he's already said that he believes that Mexicans and other people in Central America that want to migrate to the United States, that they have a human right to do so. And because it's a human right issue, Mexico and the Mexican government will facilitate that. So if you've ever had questions about whether we will need a wall, whether it's a physical wall or a virtual fence or whatever it might be, This is probably very good evidence of that indeed. We have more coming to the border than ever before because at first there was a fear on the part of some of these individuals. You can call them undocumented immigrants or undocumented aliens. You can call them illegal aliens, whatever phrase you want to use, that they were convinced that they would be quickly deported and that they would not be able to get in the door. And now, as they have seen some of the protests against Donald Trump, they are, I think, heartened that indeed, if they can make their way across the border or they can get a visa and then overstay their visa, they will probably never be removed from this country. And so as a result, I think you're going to see more and more. And now that you have a president in Mexico, and very soon will be in that administration, being willing to facilitate that, I think you know exactly what happens on the borders of the United States. So those are some other issues to put on the table. When we come back, I want to briefly talk about a couple of other issues. One of those is a piece that was written by Alex Parker. I love the way he titles it, Fish Jumping into the Boat. Donald Trump thanks Waters and Pelosi for the political gains, because his argument, and I think it's a good one, is that Donald Trump sometimes has generated a fair amount of support for himself, but much more of that support has come from individuals that have been repelled by some of the things that have been said by some of these Democratic leaders. And then, of course, that would be Maxine Waters and Nancy Pelosi. And then Dennis Prager has written about if we are Nazis, then expect more violence. Because if you believe that the phrase, these are Nazis and this is just nothing more than a concentration camp, but that's just, words, then it's kind of cheapened the Holocaust and Nazi Germany. But if indeed you believe, and I think most of these people believe that indeed is who we're fighting against, then there are all sorts of, I think, violent actions that could take place in the future, because desperate circumstances require desperate means. And so we'll get into that and then spend some time, if we can, talking about some of these Supreme Court nominees, and in particular, some of the attacks that have come against Amy Coney Barrett, some of which are, first of all, actually completely erroneous and inaccurate, others which are inappropriate and maybe even constitute a religious test. And again, I hold up my Constitution to say the Congress does not allow a religious test. The executive branch does not allow a religious test because the Constitution does not allow a religious test. So we'll come back and talk about that in just a minute and give you a chance. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to leave a message on our Facebook Live post, I'll try to read some of those as well. And in the next hour, Dr. Barry Creamer will be with us. We'll pick up some of the conversation I'm having here with him and also get some of your comments as well. A lot taking place already around the country on this day before the 4th of July. Visit our website. We'll be back right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View.
The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I want to talk a little bit longer about some of the controversy unfolding, then we'll look at a few of the possible nominees to the Supreme Court. One of the people on Facebook here was saying, I want Ben Shapiro as Supreme Court Justice. That's not going to happen, and he knows it won't either. And it's interesting because a number of people that we might even like to have on the court, whether it's Mike Lee, whose name has pretty much faded off the list, and Ted Cruz, who said he's not interested, and of course you mentioned Ben Shapiro and a lot of others, they want to get involved in the political battle, and sitting on the court might be of interest to them, but that's not where they're going to focus their time and attention. But we will look at Amy Coney Barrett as well as Brett and a few of the other individuals that we'll get to, Brett Kavanaugh and some of the others, and I'll get to that list. But let me just real quickly go through this piece by Alex Parker. I thought it was really good. Fish jumping into the boat. Donald Trump thanks Waters and Pelosi for the political gains. And he goes through the list. You know, you're familiar with it, and we'll get into it again in just a few minutes. Maxine Waters calling for harassment of the cabinet. Sarah Sanders and Kirstjen Nielsen being rejected at restaurants, and he even mentions Peter Fonda. I'm not even going to get into the awful things he said, but nevertheless, he says Trump has generated a lot of support for himself. Well, I'd say some support for himself. However, a great deal of his popularity has come from the antics of Democrats. They repel voters in droves, and here is again a good example of those. Donald Trump has never missed an opportunity to send a tweet out, but one of those said Congresswoman Maxine Waters, an extraordinarily low IQ person, has become, together with Nancy Pelosi, the face of the Democratic Party. She has just called for harm to supporters, of which there are many of the Make America Great Again movement. And later on talks about how, again, they're a leadership team that wants open borders and unlimited crime, and, you know, all the things Donald Trump will say. But the point is that as you go through this article, you just see time and time again, whether you look at anecdotal evidence, or now we're starting to get some of the polling evidence, there are just a lot of people who, up until recently, said, you know, I probably would vote for the Democratic candidate, because when they do the generic ballots, because oftentimes we did not know who was going to be necessarily the Republican or Democratic nominee in some of these congressional races, the Democrats did very well. And you could just see it slipping over time, every time, especially somebody like a Maxine Waters or Nancy Pelosi or some of the others made some of those statements. And the concern that people are raising is, will this result in violence? I mean, right now, the violence is people blocking the doors of the ICE offices, a brick being thrown through the window of the Republican Party. But where does this go? And I think Dennis Prager's been on the program with us a couple of times before, says if we're Nazis, expect more violence. And he says the American left has put itself in a moral quandary. Either it doesn't mean it when it calls the president and supporters Nazis, in which case it is merely guilty of cheapening, and as I explained in a previous comment, actually denying the Holocaust, or it, and he has doesn't, I think he means does, or it does mean it, in which case morality demands that it take violent action against Trump supporters. And he said, you know, in some respects, his argument is we're fighting a second civil war, but it isn't, at least so far, violent like the first Civil War. And he gives all sorts of examples, some of which you have heard, others you haven't. A Senate intern shouts an obscenity at the President of the United States in the halls of Congress. U.S. Senator for which she works does not fire her. Left-wing mobs chant no justice, no sleep in front of homes of administrative officials. We've mentioned a few of those before. Of course, Maxine Waters, best known for saying, let's make sure we show up wherever we have to show up. And if you see anybody from the cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and create a crowd and you push back on them and you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere. Now, again, we've given some credit for a few of the leaders in the Democratic Party that have denounced it, but very, very few. You know as well as I do that if there is something like that that is said by a conservative, by a Republican, they go after that very quickly. As a matter of fact, they're oftentimes very critical even of statements that were not even issued in public, and apologies issued and things of that nature. But nevertheless, you again have to look at what some of these leaders are saying. And Peter Breinart, individual we've quoted here quite often in The Atlantic, said, if you believe the President of the United States is leading a racist, fascist movement that threatens the rights, if not the lives of vulnerable minorities, how far are you willing to go to stop it? And so the point is that you start having this mindset that says that these desperate times require desperate actions. And since we mentioned Ben Shapiro, I'll use the Dennis Prager illustration because there's so many others. But he says, when you have people like Ben Shapiro, who's very critical of the president, to put it mildly, needs protection of bodyguards and police officers in riot gear when speaking on American college campuses, it's clear where we're headed. Where he says you can get the idea by looking at the biology professor, Dr. Brett Weinstein, who is a progressive liberal, who was the faculty member at Evergreen State University, but because he refused to cooperate when left-wing students demanded that all whites leave the university campus for a day, months later he was told by the university administration it could no longer guarantee his safety, and that's why he had to leave Evergreen State University for good. So, and of course, we can talk about so many of these other circumstances. Charles Murray, he has an example there, and we've documented those so often in the past. And it's just an illustration of kind of what is unfolding right before our very eyes. And so Gary Bauer has a comment about that that came out just the other day. He says, there are all sorts of people now that even in the midst of positive economic news, and he points out that it is quite possible that we will have for the second quarter 4% growth. It was 3% last year, which is much higher than the 1% plus growth that was taking place over the last 8 years. But he says, now we know there are plenty of people who see nothing but doom in these developments. Ronald Reagan, he said, called these folks doomsayers, by which he generally meant liberals. And Gary Bauer, of course, served in the Reagan administration, said, as harsh as his critics were then, I have to say today's brand is worse. Not only do they see disaster around every corner, but they offer intimidation and threats, the whiff of violence to get their way. Points out that last night, he said, Michael Moore went on Stephen Colbert and urged his fellow liberals to put our bodies on the line to stop Trump. So again, you can begin to see where this could lead if we don't have more voices saying it is time to tamp down the rhetoric. It is certainly past time to tamp down the violence that may unfold. And so this brings us to one of the articles we've posted on our website about one of the Supreme Court nominees, where most of the time and attention and anger is being actually surfaced, and that is a woman by the name of Amy Coney Barrett. This is an individual very well credentialed because she served on the Law Review. She had an appellate court clerkship. She was also a clerk for Justice Scalia. She was with a law firm as well, a law professor at a law school, and, of course, now a federal judge on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. So if you look at her credentials, outstanding. So why is she being vilified? Well, in her confirmation hearings to the Seventh Circuit Court, you may remember, we talked about this on the program, that they pointed to the fact that she's, are you ready for this? A Christian, a Catholic Christian. You know, that's a twofer right there, isn't it? Now, it's okay if you're a Catholic and you don't really believe it. I mean, most of the Supreme Court have Catholics on the court. They're like pro-abortion Catholics. They don't take seriously some of the pronouncements from the church. That's not the point. She served at Notre Dame. She believes in it. She had 7 children by herself and adopted 2, so she has 9 children. That alone caused a lot of people heartbreak and concern. But perhaps the best had to do with the fact that when these particular confirmation hearings were taking place for her appointment to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, Senator Dianne Feinstein from California actually imposed what most people believe was a religious test. Senator Feinstein said, when I read your speeches the conclusion one draws is that the dogma lives loudly within you, and that's concern when it comes to big issues that large number of people have fought for. And one of the big issues they've been making a point about is that she is actually part of a Christian small group called People of Praise. And this one is something that David French has written about. It is our second article. And after talking about some of the things in the article, I love what he said. He said, when I read the article last year, I rolled my eyes so hard that I almost injured myself. So we're going to come back and talk about this issue of the People of Praise. And one of the things I want to do is we want to spend as much time as we possibly can helping you understand that there's already false information being spread, and there's a good example of that that's been spread about Amy Coney Barrett. We'll talk about that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Recently, we discussed the Supreme Court's decision in Trinity Lutheran v. Comer. Chief Justice Roberts declared it odious to the Constitution for the state to prevent a church from participating in a public benefit merely because of its religious status. The newest member of the court, Justice Neil Gorsuch, felt compelled to qualify his endorsement of the majority opinion. In his concurring opinion, Justice Gorsuch suggests removing the false distinction between religious status and religious use. As an example, he asks, quote, does a religious man say grace before dinner, or does a man begin his meal in a religious manner, unquote. The same facts could be described in the same way, but under the court's decision, only one is protected. Justice Gorsuch reveals that he believes that the First Amendment protects more than religious status when he writes, quote, neither do I see why the First Amendment's free exercise should care, unquote. Whether status or use, the point of the First Amendment is to protect religious exercise. He says, quote, I don't see why it should matter whether we describe that benefit, say, as close to Lutherans, status, or close to people who do Lutheran things, use. It is free exercise either way, unquote. It's good to see the newest member of the court thinking so clearly. The First Amendment should protect the free exercise of religion, regardless of status or use. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes, let me just mention that we're going to have Dr. Barry Creamer with us. In the next hour, we're going to be talking about some of these issues and, of course, also just educating you a little bit more about the Criswell College. So lots of things to cover in just a few minutes. But let me come back to this particular issue of Amy Coney Barrett. And the Constitution has a phrase that says there shall be no religious test. And that was actually included in large part because you didn't want to have a situation where they said only Presbyterians or only Baptists. Of course, it would probably never been Baptists, but only Puritans or only Quakers or whatever could serve, that you were not to apply a religious test. Well, now you almost have what's taking place in the various confirmation hearings and even in some of the popular culture, sort of an anti-religious test. And as I pointed out, Amy Coney Barrett, when she was being considered and confirmed for the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, had this comment from Senator Dianne Feinstein in California, in which the senator said, when you read your speeches, the conclusion one draws is that the dogma lives loudly within you, and that's of concern when you come to big issues that large numbers of people have fought for years in this country. Now, that was kind of a very direct comment, which, interesting enough, as we talked about on this program before, had a fair amount of pushback, even from some that would call themselves liberals and say, well, wait a minute, that's a pretty significant sort of religious test. If you don't like what she said, say it. If you don't like how she ruled in a court case, rule that way. But don't, start attacking her dogma. And now there has been sort of a movement in a different direction. And that is, there has been this concern that, well, she's part of what's called a tightly knit Christian group called People of Praise. And this is a group, not her church, which is the real problem. Now, that surfaced a while back, but again, they saw maybe the possibility that she could make her way to the Supreme Court. And so this article goes on to cast the group almost in cult-like terms. It talks about they have a lifelong oath of loyalty. It uses special religious language, like saying that the person that heads up the small group is a head or handmaiden. Again, you know where those phrases are going. And as you read through this particular piece that was talking about whether this would have an influence on Amy Coney Barrett's independence, it said legal scholars said that such loyalty oaths could raise legitimate questions about a judicial nominee's independence and impartiality. The scholars said in interviews that while there are certainly no religious test for office, it would have been relevant for the senators to examine what it means for a judicial nominee to make an oath to a group that would yield significant authority over its members. Really? And again, David French, I love his turn of phrase. He said, when I read the article last year, I rolled my eyes so hard I'd almost injured myself. Because talking about small groups. And if you've been in a church, you know we have small groups, right? But anyway, he goes on to say, but beyond the basic facts about People of Praise, I was amused by the article for a different reason. It betrays a fundamental ignorance about the way millions of American Christians live their lives. He says, you see, for many of us, myself included, what happens at church is just the beginning of our efforts to build. And he goes through and gives us a little bit of history about small groups and evangelical churches and everything, but then he brings it back to personal. He says, many years ago, before I was married, I belonged to a parachurch organization that enriched my life immeasurably. We prayed together, we worshiped together, we ate meals together, we even lived together. My two roommates were members of the same group. We often engaged in the same kinds of community outreach. We held each other accountable. When one member of the group strayed from biblical teaching, the language of covenant, we maintained deep relationships to this very day. What was the name of that radical, scary group? The Harvard Law School Christian Fellowship. Great turn of phrase. He should have ended it right there. He goes on and says a couple of other interesting things. But nevertheless, one of the things we've wanted to do as this is taking place is to educate you. We've encouraged you to actually go to our website, and you will see a Take Action section that says a critical time to pray. And with this vacancy on the Supreme Court, we want to give you some prayer targets. And one, which will probably come out very soon, has to do with just praying about the misinformation that has already surfaced about Amy Coney Barrett. And in the interest of time, I will use this one. And that is the Center for American Progress has now, as one individual points out, been brazenly lying about her judicial record, and actually has made this statement. So I'm going to read the post, the Twitter post. You can read it for yourself. It says, as a judge, Barrett cited against an African-American separate but equal arrangement flying in the face of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Now she's up for a seat on our nation's highest court. The problem with that is every bit of it is wrong. Let's take it step by step. The decision was not written by Amy Barrett, number one. Number two, Amy Barrett was not on the 3-judge panel that rendered the verdict. She even was not part, number three, of the entire 3-judge panel and the 7th Circuit, because she wasn't put on the 7th Circuit Court until November of 2017, which is 5 months after the case was concluded. And the ruling was penned by Judge Diane Sykes, a woman certainly, but a completely different one. That you couldn't get it any more wrong than it is, and yet that Twitter post is out there, and it will probably do a lot of damage because not everybody will want to check the facts. And so here again, I hope you'll listen to Point of View so we can give you just a little bit of the information that is erroneously being spread out there on the internet. Of course, Amy Barrett, Coney Barrett, is only one of the individuals, 45 years of age, a former University of Notre Dame law professor, confirmed, and an individual that has served there, worked in private practice, as we pointed out, also has been part of the law faculty of Notre Dame. But another individual being considered as well, somebody that Kelly Shackelford knows very well, 52 years of age, Brett Kavanaugh, who serves on the U.S. a former clerk for Justice Anthony Kennedy. That fits very well. Special counsel and assistant to President George W. Bush and nominated to the D.C. court back in 2003. However, he wasn't confirmed until 2006. This slow walking of nominees has been taking place for some time. Those are two individuals that are certainly in the running, and the two that CBS is convinced are in the final running, but there are others which we can talk about as well, but we need to take a break. When we come back, we want to talk about some of the cases that have come down over the last couple of weeks from the Supreme Court in terms of religious liberty. What does that mean for those of us who are Christians in religious liberty? What does it even mean for things like the Criswell College and Christian higher education? We're going to be talking about that with Dr. Barry Creamer, and I think you will appreciate his conversation with us. And, of course, we'll open up the phones to give you a chance to join the conversation as well. I've given you some action items, and the first one, as I just pointed out a minute ago, was to actually sign up and receive our prayer updates. We believe that it is a critical time to pray because of this vacancy on the Supreme Court. And we also will not only give you prayer targets, but as we saw in just a minute from this erroneous post, that's a nice way to say it, from the Center for American Progress, the statement that she actually cited against an African-American worker. Well, first of all, that's not even an accurate rendition of the case. But more importantly, Amy Coney Barrett was not on the court then and did not render the decision. So those are the kinds of misinformation that we want to try to clear up so that you have the best information possible and you can be in prayer and in discussions with your friends, your neighbors, and your coworkers. Let's take a break. When we come back, we have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right here on Point of View.
If you've listened for any length of time, you've probably heard about Point of View listeners who've done amazing things, started ministries, found their life's calling, impacted their city, their state, the nation. But let me be clear, you don't have to have a huge impact to be faithful. I thought about that when I read a note from Joanne in Texas. She admitted, up until recently, I've not had much of a political view, nor have I ever been so informed. But since I signed up for your email and website information, I can now get the correct information that the public is oblivious to. Joanne ended by thanking us for the Take Action section of our website, where we make it easy for you to express your views on key issues with your elected representatives. Everything we do on the air, online, through mail and email is made possible through people like you who invest in Point of View so we can invest in issues that matter. Take your place on the Truth Team. Call 1-800-347-5151 or sign up online at pointofview.net/team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the day before the 4th of July, but we're still going to be talking about a lot of issues in the news, and we certainly do welcome your phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Just a program note, tomorrow we will run a tape, and it is kind of the best of. And I'm always a little bit saddened that some of the best interviews we've ever done, we play on days when I know a lot of you don't listen. So if you can make a point of trying to listen in, I think you will appreciate all 3 hours we're going to be playing tomorrow. My commentary tomorrow is on the 4th of July. My commentary today is on Starbucks and wages. We'll get into that maybe a little bit later. But I am privileged to have in studio somebody I've wanted to get in here for some time. We've moved to this new studio here and wanted to get Dr. Barry Creamer on the program. We've had him on in the past. He is the president now of Criswell College and has served in the past both as a faculty member and the vice president for academic affairs, a graduate of Baylor University, Criswell College, and the University of Texas at Arlington. Also serves on the executive committee, or has served at least on the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, and a fellow talk show host. So, Dr. Barry Creamer, it's great to have you back in studio.
And it's a privilege to be on with you. Thanks for inviting me.
What do you think of this new studio
I
here?
love it. I'm really impressed. I haven't been in here before. It's really nice.
Same table. This table's been around since 1991, I think is when it was built, although it's been recovered, and a few new microphones and some things like that. But you've been around for a long time, and I've been on your program, KCBI, for people in the Dallas area that know that. And one of the things I thought might do before we get into some of the issues in the news is talk about the Criswell College, because this is an opportunity for young people, especially, that want to get a Bible education, especially from individuals that really believe the Word of God. Sad to say, but there are some Christian colleges, I'm not so sure that I could necessarily say that without some hesitation, but I can say that having been at the Criswell College and having had my daughter even worked at your institution as well.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I would say with certainty there are colleges that do not value that at all. And we even have inerrancy in our mission statement that we believe in the inerrancy of Scripture. So, yeah, we love doing ministry training. We have it in a variety of ways. It is a college that's accredited and has a great program. We say it's for ministry training, but ministry goes beyond the church. Obviously, we train a lot of preachers, a lot of church leaders, but we're training public school teachers and psychologists and counselors and those who want to have an influence in terms of public policy and legislation. And so we love Kelly Shackelford, for instance. We've had interns with him. And so we love doing what we do. We like students who are called by God, who know they're going to give their whole lives to God. Their career belongs to God, not to themselves. That kind of student, when they're looking for somewhere to study, we think Criswell College is the very best place for them to go. We love having them there and seeing them graduate and go change the world for Christ. That's the whole point.
I might mention that we have, of course, your website, barrycreamer.com. Coffee with Creamer is the name of it, which is fun. And then you can also find a link to the Criswell College. Let me talk about that for another few minutes, because one of the things I love about the Criswell College is the dedication to practical ministry helps. For example, you require your students to go out and do evangelism. I'm sad to say I speak occasionally at Christian colleges, seminaries. Sometimes you're lucky if there's even a course on evangelism, much less the practical ministry emphasis that you have. Can you speak to that?
That's exactly right. As much as we value doctrinal integrity, applied ministry counts just as much, and in applied ministry, nothing's more than evangelism. In fact, I'll tell you, just 2 days ago, our vice president for academic affairs actually came down to the office and shared with us that he had just led the copy repairman to Christ. So that was really,
That's
it's
so
exciting
good.
to do that. Yeah. And it was because someone else in the building said, I think it might be worth talking to this guy. He's mentioned a couple of things. And so he was just attentive to that. So that was Dr. Woodell. But yeah, we love the whole idea that doctrinal integrity is not enough if it doesn't lead to a change in the way you act around people who need Christ and around people who are following Christ. So, we value both of those. In fact, I would say there are 4 things we always do at Criswell College. We've done them from the very beginning. The shape they have in culture might change over time. But doctrinal integrity is balanced by applied ministry the same way academic rigor is balanced by cultural engagement. We don't want to just be ivory tower. We have a very good academic program. We're very committed to that. But pairing up that with cultural engagement and saying the only reason it matters that you learn these things and get a grip on how to talk through very complex matters is so that you can look at the culture and say, this is how we ought to be influencing the culture. And man, we can talk about that, but where the culture has gone, even over the last couple of decades, has changed the way Christians have to think about having an influence in that society. And we're trying to lead the way with our students having that influence to shape the culture.
Well, you anticipated my next comment because I was just saying one of the other things I like about that is cultural engagement. Now, that was true when Dr. Richard Land was there. That's been true with other presidents that have been there that have taught about the cultural milieu. But you know as well as I do, Dr. Kramer, that sometimes we've all been in churches where we hear this great sermon. At the end, we go, wonderful biblical insight. I have not a clue as to how to apply it to my day-to-day life. I have not a clue as to how that relates to some of the issues we might talk about today, ranging from religious liberty to immigration to whatever's in the news. And you really, again, at Criswell College, really work at that, I know.
Yeah, and there is, we have a traditional way. We've talked about that. By the way, your comment about the sermon reminds me of Dr. Bryant. I know you knew him.
Yes.
He passed away a couple of years ago, but he used to always say, and he was quoting someone else, I don't know who, but he used to always say to students, how many points should a sermon have? And he would always say, at least one. You have to know what to do with it when you're finished. And for us, that is the point with cultural engagement.
Yes.
But there are a lot of us, Kerby, and you know this. You have people in and out of your studio all the time to talk about this and to make this point. There are a lot of us as believers who in 1970 were relating to the culture a certain way, and in 2018 are trying to relate to it exactly the same way. And the culture is not where it was in 1970. Some of that's good. Some of it's horrible. Most of it's probably bad. But at Criswell College, what we're working on is teaching students how to relate to the church on one hand. And, if I can just point straight to the issue, the reality of Christian ministry and what Jesus was doing in the Gospels wasn't pointing outside of the religious leaders and outside of Judaism and outside of what would become the church to the culture and saying, this is what's so terrible about our culture. He was pointing at the religious leaders and saying, this is where you've gone wrong. This is where you've become complicit in the sin of the culture. And so we're trying to say that as a college, we're trying to train church leaders and Christian leaders who are going to lead through their church one way or another to look at the culture and say, these are the values that we've always had that ought to be maintained. Sanctity of human life, obviously. Religious liberty, obviously. Those things, traditional marriage and understanding of the relationships between people, that's just fundamental. So we want to preserve those values, but at the same moment, point at the church and say, without recognizing it, you have become complicit in these things that we think of as sins in the culture and other things that we don't even recognize as sins in the culture because they're so ensconced in the church itself. So we're trying to point in both directions and say we can do a better job of representing Christ in this culture.
And again, one of the other things I've always appreciated the fact you've been a talk show host and willing to take on those Christian issues and look at it from a Christian worldview. Again, I dare say that some presidents of some Christian colleges probably not the kind of people I want to put on radio because either it would be so academic or it would be so kind of ethereal that it wouldn't be helpful. So again, that's just another thing that you bring to the table.
We do try to avoid. I love philosophy and I love all of that. What you're talking about. I will say I probably can't climb to a level that would leave anybody behind. But even if I could, I wouldn't want to do that. I really do. The whole point is the difference it makes in real life, the difference it makes at church, the difference it makes at work, the difference it makes in the schoolroom, the difference it makes when a student's trying to figure out how to be obedient. And what happens, Kerby, is you have students who are very enthusiastic but don't know how to apply it. We want to help them get to where they can actually apply it.
Be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The Starbucks CEO announced that he was going to close down 150 stores. The argument given by the company was that these stores were hit with declining sales. While that may be true, economists have noticed another reason why these stores may be closing. According to an article by Brandon Morse, the first stores on the chopping block are those located in cities where the Fight for 15 crowd has had their victories. If you're not familiar with the movement, they are activists who have been fighting to increase the starting wage to $15 per hour. The Fight for 15 began in 2012 when 200 fast food workers walked off their job in New York City. In his statement, Starbucks CEO Kevin Johnson didn't mention the $15 per hour issue directly, but you can read between the lines. He said that he was closing the stores in the major metro areas where increases in wages and occupancy and other regulatory requirements make Starbucks stores unprofitable. Yes, that would be those places with high minimum wage hikes and additional regulatory burdens. You usually find them in blue cities and in blue states. It's worth noting that while he is planning on closing many of these urban stores, he's also planning on opening Starbucks stores in less regulated suburban stores. So far, the Fight for 15 activists haven't been as successful in those venues. This isn't the first time I've talked about the impact of raising the minimum wage on businesses. We've seen the negative impact on all businesses in the Seattle area. We've even seen the impact nationwide on some businesses like Chipotle and Red Robin. If you raise the cost of labor in a business with small margins, it can become unprofitable and eventually go out of business. Starbucks is finding it hard to make a profit when activists force you to pay more than your business model would allow. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have in studio with us today Dr. Barry Creamer, and again, he is the president of the Criswell College. If you'd like to know more, we have a link to his website. And also, as I mentioned just a minute ago, on the executive committee of the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, we were talking about cultural engagement. So I thought what we would do is read, first of all, a little bit from this piece that is our first article today on our website, pointofview.net, by our friend Robert Knight. Robert Knight's been a friend for years, and it's entitled, Are You Tired of Winning? Because you might remember that was one of the things President Trump was saying, and he gives us a couple of examples of that. On June 4th, he says the court upheld the right of a Christian baker, Jack Phillips, in Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission, not to be forced to facilitate a same-sex wedding. Talks about that being a 7-2 ruling, but most of these others are 5-4, and that the court also applied that ruling to the Washington State florist, Baronelle Stutzman, who was a grandmother who was convicted under state law for not servicing a homosexual wedding. Then he talks about on June 11th, you have a case that came down from Samuel Alito, again, a 5-4 decision saying that Ohio has a right to begin to remove voters if they've changed their residence after a number of elections where they did not vote and where they received multiple notifications. Then you have, of course, the travel ban, which I'll skip over. Then on June 26th, the National Institute of Family and Life Advocates versus the Attorney General of California, again ruling, in this case by Clarence Thomas, that the court did not have to advertise abortions in pregnancy centers. And then one more. June 27th, you have this case having to do with whether or not public employees could be forced to pay union dues for a union they did not want to join. Now, the theme that runs through these, Dr. Creamer, are, first of all, religious liberty, but even a broader one is kind of compelled speech.
Yes.
Kelly Shackelford has said it's bad enough when the government censors your speech. It's even worse when it says, no, you have to say this.
Yep.
You have to participate in that wedding. You have to provide that florist arrangement. You have to provide that cake, or you have to promote abortion at a pregnancy center.
Yeah.
And in every case, I think the court ruled right, which is why I said, I guess we're doing some winning here. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd say, and some of these were sort of set up by how poorly the other side argued their case. So
yes.
Thank heavens for that. And I mean that literally. We're thankful to God that it came down the way it did. And some of the absurdity of imposing speech on an artist with a cake, and things like that. They also, though, reveal underneath in the culture a problem that's still going to exist after these rulings are finished. Sometimes we forget that no matter what happens in the court isn't actually producing the cake or asking for the wedding. They're just passing judgment based on the information that they get. And it's the same thing with Roe v. Wade. We look at the court as the problem, but the court never had an abortion.
Yeah.
That's the culture that did it. The fact that we were willing to do it is the problem. And it's such a horrific shame that we would have states who believed that it was the right idea to compel this kind of speech.
Yeah.
To go to people who are pro-life, and you and I both are big advocates in the sanctity of life issue.
Right.
To go to any pro-life organization and think that somehow it would make any sense at all to compel them to advertise for abortion is an absurdity from anyone with a moral conscience. And yet a state tried to do it. What is going on in our culture that enough people, and I'm not criticizing just California, we can do that freely later if we want to, but in our culture, there are enough people who can gather together and say, I think it does make sense to compel people who don't believe in this thing to speak in favor of it. We need our whole culture to be not only tolerant, but endorsing of this kind of behavior. Kerby, there was a debate that I participated in several years ago at Collin County College with their atheist group that was up there. They invited me. They were very gracious. We had a very good interaction, and I was grateful for the opportunity. They wanted half the debate about whether God exists, and they wanted half the debate about traditional marriage and homosexuality, and this was before Obergefell. So when we entered into that discussion, my whole argument from the beginning was simply to say, look, I'm not advocating for the ability to keep you from doing this or that. I'm just advocating that you would not make me say, against my religious beliefs, that I approve of it, that I actually think it's a good idea. That's all I want, is the ability to preserve my religious liberty enough not to have to say something that I don't believe. And it's amazing that our culture's come that far.
Well, and again, that's one of the questions that a lot of people were asking for a while, and that is, could you force one of your Criswell College graduates, who is now a pastor, to perform a same-sex wedding? And we were always had all this hand waves, that would never happen. Well, maybe that hasn't happened yet, but we do have photographers, florists, bakers. I mean, again, it's not just Jack Phillips, but it's Aaron and Melissa Klein in Oregon. I just mentioned Baronelle Stutzman and all sorts of other individuals that were forced to do these kinds of things. And, of course, the argument is not a live and let live, or, well, if you don't want to provide the abortifacient, I'll go to another pharmacy. If you do not want to provide the cake, I'll go to another bakery. It's, no, you have to, and if you don't, the whole weight of government will come down upon your head.
Yeah, and the heartbreaking thing about it is that what you're saying to people is, if you're in a church, because we recognized that pastors were probably not going to be forced to do that, at least for a few decades. Yes. It would take a while to break down that barrier. But outside of the church, saying, oh, no, you're in a public marketplace, you're providing a public service, you have to do it for someone else, that means we're not allowed to carry our religious convictions into the public marketplace. And that you could hear this in the previous presidential administration when they would say, oh, we're all in favor of the freedom to worship. But freedom to worship and freedom of religion are two different things. We want to express our religion not only in worship, but Monday through Saturday. And I'm using a metaphor there, but we mean 7 days a week. out in the public marketplace. And restricting that is what buries religion into this obscurity that makes it useless. The whole point is to carry it everywhere with you every day.
If you'd like to join our conversation, we'd love to hear your thoughts, because this first article says, well, maybe this has been a good couple of weeks. Of course, also, as I have mentioned, and we'll spend a little bit more time later on talking about, we have a Supreme Court nominee that will be announced next Monday, and it could be Amy Coney Barrett, or it could be Brett Kavanaugh, or somebody else that is not on that short list, although we have a pretty good idea of who the president's been interviewing, so we'll get into that a little bit later. But I'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. Are you encouraged if these decisions have gone the other way? Would you have been discouraged? And that's an important question. And I want to come back to you, Barry Creamer, to talk about something else, and that is you're preparing people for ministry. And I say this so often that maybe it's getting trite, but I say politics is downstream from culture. In a lot of cases, these decisions were made in the popular culture a long time ago, and politics just shows the results of those. And it seems to me that Christians should be involved in the political process, and we encourage people to sign up to receive our prayer alerts, and I'll explain why that's important a little bit later this hour. But I think it's more important for us to be involved in cultural engagement.
And let me just engage that for a second and say this is why we want to continue to educate preachers. I think we put out the best preachers in the country. We love it. So that's a priority ministry for us. But in the same way, when we look at the public school system, for instance, we have teachers. We've just started a Bachelor of Science in Education. I'm not trying to do a promo for the school, but I am at the same time.
Sure.
But the reality is we've started this program. We have a couple of teachers who are working in public school districts in this area. And we're guests in the public school system. We're not disrespectful in any way, but just being able to communicate basic values that are, as you mentioned earlier, a part of the Constitution. Just teaching those basic values and representing the kingdom of God as people who are loving, gracious, kind, representatives of the kingdom in a public school with those students, that can bring transformation to students' minds so that when they grow older, I'll put it this way, Kerby, we can get a court ruling in our favor. We can get a court that's in our favor, but it won't change the minds of the people who are in the culture. And you were just talking about that. The culture runs ahead of the court in many ways, and the court is going to follow the lead of the culture in some ways. And I want laws that reflect the right things. So I want moral laws. So don't get me wrong. I'm delighted when the court is making good decisions. But at the same moment, if the culture doesn't change its opinion, then human behavior is not going to end up changing much. And the first opportunity for those laws to change again, they'll change again. So if we want permanent transformation in the culture, we have to start at the very basics and show people a kingdom that is so much better, that their hearts are actually transformed by the gospel and the evangelism that you were just talking about a moment ago as well.
Might just mention in the second hour, we're going to be talking about the presentation of the gospel at the World Cup. And so that'll be kind of fun as well. So again, we recognize how important the gospel is, but it's also important for us to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world, to be involved in cultural engagement. And love to get your comments. Let's open up the phones. We are privileged to have with us for another half an hour Dr. Barry Creamer, who is the president of the Criswell College. And when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about what's on his website. And also, we have a take action item for you to respond to. So a lot more coming up right after these important messages.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of view can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221, or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
An open line if you would like to join our conversations, 1-800-351-1212. Perhaps you have some thoughts about Christians being the salt of the earth, the light of the world, cultural engagement. That's certainly one issue. We're going to get to in just a minute whether or not Amy Coney Barrett or whether a number of other individuals, probably Brett Kavanaugh, will be the next Supreme Court justice, or at least the one that is nominated. Who would you like to see on the court? What kind of individual do you believe this is going to be a really significant battle? So I'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Barry Creamer with us for the rest of this hour, and we have a link to barrycreamer.com. Coffee with Creamer is the website.
That's it.
And first of all, there is an opportunity for people to download some of your material. What is Preaching, for example, on iTunes and the podcast? Talk about what's available.
Yeah, we basically every show we do goes into a podcast, and we have a lot of listeners who are not in our listening area. We don't cover nearly as mammoth an area as you do at Point of View, but a lot of people listen to it on podcast instead. So we make every show available on there. We have shows about ministry like that one, how to do ministry better, how to rethink it, both as a church member or as a church leader. We have scripture shows, we call them, just me expositing scripture, just talking through the book of Luke, for instance.
Right.
Right now, we're in the middle of Luke chapter 12, as it turns out. And then we have shows about public policy issues, and we have these free-for-all shows, we call them, with a variety of topics that different people bring. We just try to bring a Christian perspective to it, apply a Christian worldview to it. Yeah, I would encourage them to get it at iTunes or somewhere.
And again, you've got material on education, parenting, all the topics that you would imagine. And again, so the radio program is available for individuals, even if they're outside of the listening area.
Yes.
And also, again, people can follow that link to Criswell College. Now, that's a great opportunity for people to come in residence. I know you have some online material.
We do.
But you have something that is so significant, because I know that if you're an 18-year-old, you're thinking, I don't really want to live at home and go to the Criswell College. I'd kind of like to be in a dorm, and now you're going to be building a dorm.
For the first time, we've been working 4 years to get a lead gift to build our first residence hall. We've always been mostly regional. We have some people who travel in, but they've got to find their own housing. So we're very excited about having a residence hall. So we had a brand new donor, never given to Criswell, didn't even know who Criswell College was. We were doing an introductory meeting, and they stepped up, gave us a $5 million gift. So we're building a dormitory and going to have a place for those 18 and 19-year-old students to be able to study and be safe, and also engage in urban ministry, which is what people really need to do. If you can serve in a city, cities shape the culture. If you can serve in a city, if you can lead in ministry in a city, if you can learn how to relate to people in an urban setting, you can do it anywhere. And I get it. I do interim pastorates. I preach a lot in rural settings as well. But the culture is shaped by cities. And that's why W.A. Criswell did not leave downtown Dallas when he had the opportunity to do it. He believed the Christian representation needed to be in an urban setting as well. And we believe that too. We love carrying on his name and maintaining an urban ministry there. So the residence hall is going to give us great opportunity to do that. We do, if I can mention real quickly, we do have a couple of online programs that are also available, because we have staff. We know there are staff members, there are pastors who've never been able to get a master's degree. We have a Master of Arts in Christian Leadership, Master of Arts in Christian Studies, basically the first half of an MDiv, and more than that. It's a complete degree in itself that they can get without having to leave their ministry, because when you're engaged on the ground in ministry and you're 100 miles or hundreds of miles from the college, it's really hard to get that done. So we wanted to make it easier for people to get that done.
Well, again, I hope you'll check into it. If you have a young person going off to college, maybe it's a child, a grandchild, or something like that. First of all, I just say that just because it's a Christian college doesn't necessarily mean you're getting a Christian worldview. Sadly, I've been at some of those and heard really incredible horror stories that maybe they open the class in prayer, but from that point on, it's taught in a secular way. And again, because of your emphasis on practical ministry and evangelism, your emphasis on cultural engagement, and your dedication to the inerrancy of Scripture, that's a place you need to check out.
That's very impressive. You hit all four of the strokes that we try to focus on off the top of your head. I'm really impressed with that. No, it is true. And we, I will say, for the comfort of parents, sometimes parents wanted their student to go to a top school. We just had a student come in who was one of the top graduates in the area, and his parents were concerned because they were not as committed to Christ as the student was. He had gotten on fire for God. And so they were concerned. It's like, well, he's going to be going to this college that's mostly focused on Christianity, and and we really wanted him to have a good education. Just a brief conversation with them, showing them the curriculum and the quality of the academics that we do. We want students to learn everything. All truth is God's truth. We want them to learn everything, but we bring them back in that orbit that they take around all the information, reading all the authors, good, bad, and indifferent. We bring them back to a foundation that allows them to represent Christ in a powerful and a steady way, an unshakable way in this culture. And that's a challenge.
Yeah.
Some people go out
I've seen some
unprepared.
of your individuals that have graduated from Criswell College that have gone on to Ivy League schools. And some even come back and teach at your school there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
We're very proud of them.
Yeah, so just another aspect of that. Just before we get into some other issues, by the way, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I have an action item for you, and you may have heard us talk about this last week, that with this vacancy on the Supreme Court, we really do believe that, first of all, that is a real need for prayer. So one of the things we've encouraged you to do, and a number of you have signed up under our Take Action section. If you go to our website, on the left-hand column is my Viewpoints commentary, which is today about Starbucks and wages, pointing out how Starbucks is closing down 150 stores, in large part because they are in places where they have mandated $15 an hour minimum wage or all sorts of regulations and things like that. But in the middle section, we have the Take Action item, a critical time to pray. Now, the point is that if you click on that, number one, then you can actually receive some of the emails, one of which will go out here shortly. And that is, if you want to get an email, you give us your email address. If you'd like snail mail, give us our other address. But one of the things we'll be sending out today is probably the first of many needs for us to really clarify what is taking place. And that is, the Center for American Progress has now begun lying about the judicial record of Amy Coney Barrett. She's one of the individuals being considered by Donald Trump. And if you're not familiar, individual with some really outstanding credentials, because after all, she has been a professor at Notre Dame, and she has been a clerk under both circuit court judges as well as Supreme Court judges and the rest. But I'll just read the tweet that just came out. It says, as a judge, Barrett sided against an African-American worker in favor of a company's separate but equal arrangement, flying in face of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now she's up for a seat on the nation's highest court. Well, that's out there on Twitter, and once it's out there, it's like opening a feather pillow in the wind, and then the feathers splatter everywhere, and then it turns out it's wrong. And it's not just a little bit wrong, Dr. Creamer. You've probably heard me talk about this. This is off at so many levels, it's unbelievable. Number one, the decision was not written by Amy Coney Barrett. Okay, that's bad enough. Number two, Amy Coney Barrett was not on the 3-judge panel of the 7th Circuit Court. Number three, it was penned by Judge Diane Sykes. So, okay, it's a woman, but it wasn't her. But number four, turns out that the decision was rendered in November of 2017, which is 5 months before she was on the court. So at every level, this thing is wrong. Yeah. And it's one of the pieces that we will be sending out to you if you signed up on the email list, just so that at least as you are praying about these issues, and most importantly, engaged in a conversation. I mean, you have friends, neighbors, coworkers, maybe even family members that say, can you believe this? We're about ready to put a racist on the Supreme Court. Well, first of all, I do not like the characterization of that particular case in the 7th Circuit Court. But more to the point, it has nothing to do with an individual that Donald Trump might indeed nominate for the court.
And it is this is a compellingly important issue, who's going to be on the court. And Kerby, for me, the main concern is that we get somebody who recognizes that government is not the answer to all things, that we undermine the idea of an activist court that's saying the government is the solution to everything. And here, if I can just run in on this in terms of religious liberty, it all comes back to the same issue. When I talk about having compassion for the poor, having compassion on immigrants, having compassion on whatever, people will misunderstand me as if I'm promoting government intervention to do those things. I'm not talking about the government at all, but in our culture, we've come to the point where we think government is the only thing that can act to intervene when people need some kind of compassion or mercy expressed on them. And what I'm looking for in a Supreme Court justice is someone who will be a constructionist, someone who will look at the Constitution and say, no, government is supposed to have limited powers. And if we're going to solve the social ills of society, it's not going to be because of government impositions. It's going to be because we develop a virtuous society. We develop people who have the right kinds of values.
Well, again, some great comments. And again, if you have not taken the time to sign up, we have a banner there which says a critical time to pray where you can sign up, or else just go to the take action item. And that's all the more reason to sign up, because we're going to have more and more misinformation. That's a nice word for lying. But nevertheless, for these particular nominees, and it's important for you to know the difference. And that's one of the things we want to provide as a public service. If you've already signed up, you should be receiving an email a little bit later that clarifies some of that information or misinformation. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Recently, we discussed the Supreme Court's decision in Trinity Lutheran versus Comer. Chief Justice Roberts declared it odious to the Constitution for the state to prevent a church from participating in a public benefit merely because of its religious status. The newest member of the court, Justice Neil Gorsuch, felt compelled to qualify his endorsement of the majority opinion. In his concurring opinion, Justice Gorsuch suggests removing the false distinction between religious status and religious use. As an example, he asks, quote, does a religious man say grace before dinner, or does a man begin his meal in a religious manner, unquote. The same facts could be described in the same way, but under the court's decision, only one is protected. Justice Gorsuch reveals that he believes that the First Amendment protects more than religious status when he writes, quote, neither do I see why the First Amendment's free exercise should care, unquote. Whether status or use, the point of the First Amendment is to protect religious exercise. He says, quote, I don't see why it should matter whether we describe that benefit, say, as closed to Lutherans, status, or closed to people who do Lutheran things, use. It is free exercise either way, unquote. It's good to see the newest member of the court thinking so clearly. The First Amendment should protect the free exercise of religion, regardless of status or use. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes in studio with me today, Dr. Barry Kramer. And again, if you'd like to join us this hour, or even the next hour, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get to those calls a little bit later. But we talked about this situation in which you have the Center for American Progress saying that she actually, that is Amy Barrett Comey, has actually been involved in a case which interestingly enough is one that she was not actually involved with at all. So Amy Coney Barrett is actually not part of that decision. It was Judge Diane Sykes, but it's just a good illustration of sometimes what we call fake news. And I don't know if you saw this, Dr. Kramer, but the other day we have a reporter that had to resign Friday because he falsely claimed in a tweet that the gunman who opened fire there in the newsroom in Maryland, that the gunman was wearing a hat that had President Trump's campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again." And so Conor Berry said, "Folks, my 21-year career as a journalist, a fancy term that makes my skin crawl, frankly came to a screeching halt yesterday with one stupid, regrettable tweet. Can't take it back. Wish I could. My sincere apologies to all good, hardworking reporters and to the President of the United States and his supporters." And so this was where he said he was ashamed of his tweet, added that it taints the good work of fair-minded journalists everywhere. Ever heard the phrase fake news?
Oh, yeah.
There we go again.
I have heard the news, unfortunately. And I mean, I have heard the phrase, unfortunately. And in addition to that reality, you know, I would say on the other side, I wish, so I'm an educator, right? So yeah. I mean, in truth, I'm a preacher. That's what I was called to be when I was young. I still preach on weekends. That's what I do. And what I do is I care about the gospel. I care about the scriptures, but I'm an educator, and I am an educator because I love education. And I'm bringing all this back to the point to say, you know, in our culture now, there is such a doubt on both sides about what anyone says that no one believes. Kerby, I have found that we've sort of adopted a postmodern view of truth now.
Yes.
On both sides.
Right.
On the conservative side and the liberal side, everybody says, oh, well, if they said it, I'm just not going to believe it. It doesn't matter. And there's no confidence at all that there is a hard and absolute, a fixed truth out there that ought to be pursued. And I want to insert my discipline, education, higher education, as a way of saying, you know, we cannot be anti-education and be pro-Christian, because Christianity, this is in the Baptist Faith and Message, Christianity has a reliance on study, on truth, and on the pursuit of it that ought to matter to us. And so I just want to invite everybody who's a believer to say, you know, I'm not going to be anti-education, I'm not going to be anti-truth, just because there are some people who we can observe have lied, have said things that were false, and then regrettably that gets spread around. But that doesn't make all claims false. And I wish we could get back to having some confidence that even when people say things we disagree with, it might be true. And we might need to consider it every once in a while.
Well, and that's the other point that, as you said, it isn't just on one side, it's on the other side as well. I've done a week of programs on Christian myths. You know how Christians perpetuate things that are not true. And so it's real.
Say it isn't so.
And again, and we live in this, as you said, a post-truth culture. And oftentimes when I'm asked to speak on the idea of postmodernism, I have a talk called Truth Decay, Postmodernism and Relativism. And I go through and talk about how postmodernism has affected our world. And then I ask the question at the end, well, has this been just outside the church walls, or has it made its way inside the church walls? Of course, you know the answer to that. So we need to clean up our act as well, but also be willing to say, look, the other side has a good argument, and I'm all up for good arguments. And Cal Thomas has a great line. He says, you know, each morning I read my Bible and the New York Times to see what both sides are saying, you know, and he's having some fun with that. But the point is you have to read widely. And also when somebody on our side makes a mistake, hey, if you haven't heard our Millennial Roundtable, I think Nick Pitts is quicker to jump on it than anybody I know. And when the other side is making some false accusations about an individual that could be sitting on the Supreme Court, it's time to call them out, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And you were mentioning how postmodernity has fit in, not only found a way into the church, but in a lot of ways, we sort of started this fad, you know, in some of the debates that we've had doctrinally over the years, decades, you know, for forever. I can remember, I wish I could count the number of times someone said to me, you know, I'm going to read the verse this way, you're going to read it that way. There, you know, it's just a matter of opinion. Well, that's a postmodern view on it. Yeah. You're just saying there's no absolute fixed truth. So I really appreciate the way you're saying it. And this is what we try to teach in the classroom. This is what we ought to be teaching in the church. Here is the objective information. This is why we value Scripture so much. People wonder why we go to Scripture for everything we're trying to claim. It's because God gave us His documents, His truth, His doctrine, doctrines in black and white so that they would be fixed. We are just like Judaism historically, we are a people of the book. We go to a book. It's written down, and we say, this is the truth. I don't say to you, thus saith the Lord, unless I can open the Bible and say, and he said it right here. And this is how I think this ought to apply to your life. So with absolutes like that, we're in a solid position to advocate for the truth in our culture. If we give up those kinds of absolutes, we have nothing to offer the culture that they don't already have.
And this is where I think right now the theologians that are evangelicals can help some of the lawyers, because you've seen as well as I do some people that read the Bible and say, well, I know that's what the Bible says, but that's not what it means, and so I read my biases, my eisegesis into Scripture. And of course, right now you have 4 Supreme Court justices, I'd have to say, that sort of just say, I want this conclusion, so I'm going to read into the Constitution what I want it to be. Yeah. And yet we actually believe that you should read the Scriptures trying to understand its original language, in the original language, in its culture, what it meant and what Paul meant and what Jesus meant and what James meant and what Peter meant. The same thing we should require of Supreme Court justices, to go back and look at the Constitutional Convention, the Federalist Papers, and understand what was meant in the 18th century and then apply it today.
Absolutely. And if I can just pitch in on the one bit of content that I think that comes to in the Constitution and in terms of Christianity, it is the limited form of government that's described in the Constitution. That's basically what it's all about, how to limit the scope of the government, how to limit its intrusion into people's lives, which is what comes out obviously in the Bill of Rights. And for Christianity, that's not just a matter of saying we really like an American government. It is saying we like a limited government because we believe the ideas of Christianity, when they're properly informed and properly presented, the ideas of Christianity will win in an open marketplace of ideas. And we want that. We want an open marketplace of ideas. If you disagree with us, we want you to be able to say it freely. And we will never force you to say that you agree with Christianity if you don't. That's the freedom we ask for in return, and which we've seen defended by the Supreme Court just recently. So if that's the goal, government being limited, the purpose for that goal is that the gospel would then be able to speak freely into the culture, and people's lives would actually be transformed by that. That's our goal as a school, as a community of faith, as churches in the kingdom of God. We just want Christ to be presented fairly in the culture. People who need transformation will discover that's where it's going to be found. That's where new lives are had. So
well, again, if people want to contact you, we have a link to your website. If they'd like to know more about the Criswell College, they can go there and even schedule an opportunity to visit the campus.
Yes.
And if some of them say, there is no way I'm ever going to make my way to Dallas, as much as I'd like to, but...
they need to see Dallas. They'll change their mind.
But maybe so. Maybe they could still go online and take some of the courses.
Absolutely. Yeah, we can do that for it. Our online program is fantastic. We have a great director, great courses, great content. They'll leave with a theological education they need. We need our people in the churches to be well educated, to understand not only how to defend the theology that they should have as the foundation of their beliefs, but also the application to the culture, and then how to apply that in a way that other people can embrace so that it can spread, so the kingdom of God can be recognized here.
Dr. Barry Kramer, let's do this again. This was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kerby, very much.
And I know you're heading off because you have a daughter-in-law that's about ready to give you another grandchild,
Amen.
Right?
Amen to that.
That's just amazing. And I appreciate you coming in, because I was afraid that maybe the birth would presuppose your
They held off just
today.
for this.
Just for this. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about a mission to actually present the gospel to an enormous number of people that are right now in Russia and watching Russia, because we'll do that right after this.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school, until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Last hour today, we're going to spend some time talking about reaching the world with the gospel, in particular, using a very significant event. Now, if you like soccer like I do, you've been paying attention to the World Cup, a fascinating battle yesterday, interestingly enough, between Belgium and Japan, and fascinating to watch some of these various athletes. And this World Cup soccer tournament is certainly an opportunity to reach the world and even individuals in Russia with the gospel. And I thought it would be encouraging for you to know more about this, and really an encouragement for you to pray. So we bring to the microphone Sergey Rakhuba, who is the president of Mission Eurasia, which was formerly known as the Russian Ministries. It is an organization that was started by Peter Dynica. And Sergey is originally from Ukraine and later moved to Moscow, where he lived for many years, is very gifted in terms of communication, and has a vision for his homeland and really for the entire Eurasian region. He helped plant a church near Moscow and has really had a desire to train other nationals to expand evangelism and church growth. So, Sergey, welcome to Point of View today.
Oh, thank you so much, Kerby. It's a privilege to be in your show.
Well, and it is exciting to see what you have planned for the World Cup. For many of our listeners, they may be familiar with this international event, although I recognize that since America didn't even qualify, a lot of people don't pay as much attention to it as maybe I do, or certainly Europeans do. But this is an opportunity, as one of the articles I've posted here from CBN, to reach possibly millions of people. Tell us what has been taking place right now.
Yes, the whole world's eyes, just glued to Moscow, glued to the nation of Russia, where World Cup games are hosted by Russia. And, the teams from all over the world, from all countries that respect more soccer, they call it football there. And so they're enjoying watching these games. And we as Mission Eurasia, we thought that it creates a wonderful opportunity. So when the Russia is hosting this World Cup games, these events, we would mobilize churches to use this as an opportunity for outreach. So we mobilized some of our partners. We mobilized and raised enough resources to print 600,000 copies of Scripture that is, or it's been distributed, in all those events and outreach events, that organized by local churches in all those countries, all those cities where these games take place, but even farther, so through entire nation of Russia. So we use this opportunity to bring the gospel to Russia and focus people more on also another victory. So when Russia is kind of, waiting, while their team, will take a victory, we want the nation of Russia to also learn and take another victory in the gospel, victory over sin, victory, eternal victory in Jesus. And this is what World Cup Outreach is all about. So we want more people in Russia to learn about Jesus, to learn about the gospel, and victory in Him.
Let's, if we can, in just a minute, talk a little bit more about those scriptures that you're passing out. But just again, Sergey, if you'll permit me, let me educate my listeners, because when we talk about the World Cup, international football, which in this country we call soccer, but I'm just going to call it football, is the most widely viewed sporting event in the world. You can think here in the United States about how many people watch the Olympics. Well, this far exceeds that, and the World Cup in previous years has had a cumulative audience somewhere around 26 billion individuals, and about 700 million that watch a ninth of the entire population of the planet. So when you talk about the possible exposure, this is immense. And so even though for some of us in this country, this might not be something where all the eyes are fixated on it, this is just an incredible opportunity for you in Mission Eurasia to reach people that may never hear the gospel any other way.
Yeah, and that's what we are trying to do, to mobilize all the believers in Russia to use this opportunity during this World Cup games that take place in their country, so that they can introduce them to the gospel through distributing scripture that they do in their churches or in their communities. You probably have heard that in Russia they have some issues with religious freedom since, the new religious freedom regulations were posted on the nation of Russia a couple of years ago by the current administration or government of Russia. And but churches, despite of all the challenges that they may have, now they still use this opportunity and spread the gospel. And as we get all these reports now from all the places, where this outreach was organized, this outreach, despite of all these regulations that possibly try to limit evangelicals back behind their church walls, the outreach spills out to the streets, and we see groups of young people, youth, are distributing scripture in the streets, in the fan zones, and in places where lots of people come together to watch the games. And that's what's taking place now. And I like to encourage your listeners, to offer prayer support to all these churches, all these teams that are doing outreach in Russia these days, so that they will use this opportunity to this full extent to bring the gospel, to share the story of Jesus, a story of hope in Him, to the people that's in Russia.
Let me just mention we have a link to missioneurasia.org. It's on our website, pointofview.net. And you talked about those scriptures, 600,000 scriptures. As I understand, about 100,000 of them are a special edition Russian language New Testaments. And something that we've talked about on this program with a variety of people, Gene Getz in particular, where it has a QR code. Those are those funny-looking box codes which connect the users to a New Life app and all sorts of discipleship material. So these are just great resources to put in the hands of really a Bible-starved population there in Russia.
Yeah, and that's not just 100,000 copies of the specially designed New Testament. Every copy of the scripture distributed is supplied with a QR code that leads people to an app called New Life. And that's where people can load more information and get an access to more discipling materials. There are over 70 pages of discipling materials available online. But also everyone who visits that app, so they will have an access to the database and the list of addresses of all evangelical churches across Russia and even beyond, the neighboring nations, and will have a chance to establish a relationship, and visit those churches whenever they open to do that.
Sure. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Sergey Rakhuba. And if you'd like to join the conversation, maybe you've been to Russia, have a question or a comment, 1-800-351-1212. Wanted you to know about this incredible opportunity at the World Cup. We'll talk with him right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The Starbucks CEO announced that he was going to close down 150 stores. The argument given by the company was that these stores were hit with declining sales. While that may be true, economists have noticed another reason why these stores may be closing. According to an article by Brandon Morse, the first stores on the chopping block are those located in cities where the Fight for 15 crowd has had their victories. If you're not familiar with the movement, they are activists who've been fighting to increase the starting wage to $15 per hour. The Fight for 15 began in 2012 when 200 fast food workers walked off their job in New York City. In his statement, Starbucks CEO Kevin Johnson didn't mention the $15 per hour issue directly, but you can read between the lines. He said that he was closing the stores in the major metro areas where increases in wages and occupancy and other regulatory requirements make Starbucks stores unprofitable. Yes, that would be those places with high minimum wage hikes and additional regulatory burdens. You usually find them in blue cities and in blue states. It's worth noting that while he is planning on closing many of these urban stores, he's also planning on opening Starbucks stores in less regulated suburban stores. So far, the Fight for 15 activists haven't been as successful in those venues. This isn't the first time I've talked about the impact of raising the minimum wage on businesses. We've seen the negative impact on all businesses in the Seattle area. We've even seen the impact nationwide on some businesses like Chipotle and Red Robin. If you raise the cost of labor in a business with small margins, it can become unprofitable and eventually go out of business. Starbucks is finding it hard to make a profit when activists force you to pay more than your business model would allow. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Really to have with us for a little bit longer, Sergey Rakhuba, and again, he is the president of Mission Eurasia. If you'd like to know a little bit more, we have a link to missioneurasia.org. You can go to our website, pointofview.net, and find it, or go directly there. Their mission is to evangelize, train, equip, and mobilize the next generation in Eurasia to lead churches in transforming their nations for Christ. Sergey, let's, if we can, come back to a point you made just in passing, but it's worth emphasizing, and that is persecution. We all are well aware of what it was like, at least those of us that are older around the table, what it was like to live as a Christian when you had the dominant Soviet Union. But as the Iron Curtain fell, there were new opportunities. And to this day, I go to Hungary. I have a friend that goes to Belarus. We have a number of others that have gone to Russia and other places and have seen an openness. But as you point out, there has been sort of a crackdown on religious activity. There have been another of prosecutions. What's the state of religious freedom for believers in Russia today and all through Eurasia?
Yeah, you see, Russia is a little different, than other countries of Eurasia. And as your listeners may know, that back in 2016, Russia passed that harsh new Yarovaya law, that the package of laws that they put together to limit the mission work in Russia. And unfortunately, these new restrictions are limiting freedom of worship and freedom of expression, if in your religious point of view. So, and unfortunately, all the evangelical organizations, churches, they are limited just to their officially registered churches. So that's where they can, share their faith. And unfortunately, this law, since 2016, is limiting evangelicals to do any outreach work, any mission work in Russia. You know, the countries like Ukraine or Moldova or other countries of the former Soviet Union, so they experience total freedom there in terms of religious freedom. But Russia, unfortunately, so they are, seems like, trying to go back, like it used to be in the Soviet Union, where all the religious activity was heavily controlled by the government.
So again, you have the Russian Orthodox Church, where a very high percentage of Russians have some identity. The so-called Protestant churches, or what we call evangelical churches, are very, very few. So help us understand a little bit of that religious landscape, if you might, for just a minute.
Yeah, the Russian Orthodox Church that we believe, with those who analyze these regulations now, so that they are very much behind inspiring or prompting the current government, to create these regulations to limit any other religious groups but Orthodox from their more active life, activity in their nation. Russian Orthodox Church, that is traditionally known as historic, church in Russia. So where probably that's what the statistics tell us. So that 78% of all Russian citizens that would believe that they are Orthodox. If you ask how many of them believe in God, very few will confirm that. So they believe 2 to 4% of Russian citizens, more or less, those who claim that they are Orthodox, more or less, attend the church more or less regularly. So evangelicals, or they call them Protestants, so they belong to more of this foreign influence idea as they present it to their nation. And this is what this law is all about. So to limit the foreign religious influence in their nation. And so that's unfortunately what's taking place today with this new Yarovaya law that is limiting mission work, limiting evangelical activity in the country of Russia.
Well, let's, if we can, for just a few minutes before I let you go, talk about how we can be participating with you. And first of all, of course, there is an opportunity for people to get involved. I know that you have some opportunities to raise some funds with a matching grant to provide those New Testaments. I know that you have some places where people can minister. Talk to at the moment, maybe our pastors and our Sunday school leaders and others, our mission pastors. Are there some things that they can do by going to Russia or partnering with you? Obviously, we encourage everyone to be praying for you, but what are the opportunities for ministry for each one of our listeners?
Kerby, there are lots of opportunities, for people that are out there listening to get involved with ministry in Russia. Going to Russia today and do work on the ground, as we would say, and personally get involved, engaged, it would be quite difficult because of the current situation, political and religious situation in Russia, when this new law regulates and keeps foreigners away from doing any active work in Russia. Wow. But people who are there, they can get involved with their prayers. And we really, really would appreciate so that your listeners would continue praying and supporting the national church, that despite of any challenges, limitations, they have this huge desire to continue reaching their communities, their nation, with transforming gospel of Christ. And so supporting, there are so many churches out there that invested a lot in ministry in Russia, and the opportunity is still there to continue supporting, spreading the ministry of spreading the gospel in that nation. And people can learn about all these opportunities on our website. You already mentioned that, so that's missioneurasia.org, and praying and giving. So that's what continues bringing this transforming ministry to Russia. And we do still have that matching grant opportunity. So someone initiated this matching challenge to us of $75,000 that helps us to print 100,000 copies of New Testaments for this World Cup outreach. We already raised almost the entire amount, but 5,000 is still needed to meet this challenge. And I would hugely appreciate, Kerby, your listeners, if they would prayerfully consider to help us to meet this match and provide all the scripture that are needed for these teams that are reaching out to their communities, bringing the gospel, spreading the word of God, and bringing this transformation, power, influence into their nation.
Again, 600,000 scriptures, and you can be a part of that. And again, we also have a section on your website about mission trips, because people could go to, for example, your home country of Ukraine and other places. So if there are individuals that would want to partner with you in one way or another financially, if they'd like to partner with you in terms of some kind of mission trip, you're available to talk to people off air, aren't you? Is there a way in which people can contact you?
If people contact our office, so call us or email us, all this contact information is available on our website, and we will be happy to talk and see how we can accommodate your talents, your desire to go and working together with nationals shoulder to shoulder to bring the gospel to those nations. And we do invite people to come and join us and help us, on a mission, short-term mission trips to Ukraine, to Moldova. We're sending several groups this next week that will be going to Armenia, to Moldova, to Ukraine. And there are lots of opportunities to get involved, and working together in this kingdom partnership to continue transforming the gospel through equipping the nationals and supporting them and working with them together to bring the gospel to their nations in the former Soviet Union.
Again, we've been talking with Sergey Rakhuba, and let me just mention again that we have a link, first of all, to missioneurasia.org. We also have the third article. This was a very good article, I thought, by CBN News about how this ministry could reach as many as 3 million World Cup fans with the gospel, and we're talking about reaching those individuals with the scriptures and all the opportunities that exist. So take the time to visit our website. We also have a link to his website. We have a link to his Facebook page and also a Twitter post. And Sergey, I thank you so very much for joining with us. And of course, we're all looking forward to our 4th of July tomorrow. But I hope some of our listeners will pay attention to the World Cup, recognizing while they're watching what we call here soccer, what most people around the world call football, there also is the gospel going forth. And I appreciate you making that possible. And thank you for giving us some time today here on Point of View. We are going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into a couple more issues that I thought would be of interest to you before we run out of time. And so we were going to focus on what's happening not only on this decision about who will be on the Supreme Court, but some news behind the scenes about trying to abolish ICE. We'll be back right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, an open line. And let me just mention real quickly that one of the things we've been encouraging you to do is to sign up to pray about this very important decision that is going to be made by the President of the United States to provide a nominee to the Supreme Court. And so if you go to our website, pointofview.net, the vacancy on the Supreme Court presents a real unique opportunity to defend the values of our culture. And one of the reasons we want to do this is to give you information as possible prayer targets and also clear up some of the misinformation. And I mentioned this last hour, but I know people tune in and tune out. And let me just mention that, again, we have some misinformation, some inaccurate information. Some people call them lies, whatever you want to call them, about one of the possible nominees, Amy Coney Barrett. Now, she is an individual that has served on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. Before that, was a law professor at Notre Dame, has 7 children of her own, and then has adopted some, so she has 9 children, and is a very prominent Catholic and has been criticized for this for a variety of different reasons. Probably the best known is Dianne Feinstein saying, when I read your speeches, the conclusion one draws is that the dogma lives loudly within you, and that's of concern when you come to the big issues that large numbers of people have fought for years in this country. So there have been some controversy on the part of some that have recognized that she's probably a lot more pro-life than they are, and being a Catholic, nothing wrong with being a Catholic. Matter of fact, a majority of the members of the Supreme Court are Catholic, but they don't take it seriously. This is an individual that takes her Catholic theology seriously, and so that has been a problem for a number of individuals. Well, in the midst of this, there's been a lot of misinformation, and the one that we focused on today, and we're sending information out if you've already signed up, has to do with this post from the Center for American Progress that, as Charles Cook says, has been brazenly lying about her judicial record. And if you are not familiar, the actual post, which we've put in the email, says this: as a judge, Barrett sided against an African-American worker in favor of a company's separate but equal arrangement, flying in the face of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now she's up for a seat on our nation's highest court. Well, the first point that I've made already is that I don't think that case flies in the face of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Do you really think that it does? But let's get back to the key point, and that is, number one, the decision was not written by Amy Barrett. It was written by Judge Diane Sykes. Number two, Amy Coney Barrett was not on the 3-judge panel for the Seventh Circuit Court. Number three, she was not even on the Seventh Circuit Court because it wasn't until November of 2017, 5 months after the case was concluded, that she actually ended up on the court. So this is a perfect example of misinformation. And the example I used this last hour when Dr. Barry Creamer was in studio is it's a little bit like opening a feather pillow in a windstorm. All those feathers fly out, and you can't get them all back again. And so that tweet, which is out there, might even be believed by individuals. So we are convinced that if you have not already done so, it would be really appropriate for you. I know you're busy getting ready for the 4th of July, but it would be really appropriate for you to go to our website, pointofview.net, and there's a place for you to sign up. That is a opportunity for you to take some action. And what we want you to be doing is certainly praying about this particular issue, but most importantly, as you sign up to receive the email, or if you don't have an email to sign up and then give us your street address, we'll mail it to you, just to give you some information that has been misinformation, false information, inaccurate information, so that, number one, you can pray more effectively, And number two, I know you'll be involved in conversations with people that are friends, neighbors, coworkers, maybe family members, and we really want to educate you and to make sure that if we find out something about one of these nominees that we disagree with, you'll hear it from us. But at the same time, when there's misinformation out there, that is an issue as well. And our second article today on the website is a piece by our friend David French. And he said, if you've ever needed any evidence that there's a growing God gap in the American politics, and that it fosters an immense amount of ignorance and occasionally outright bigotry, look no further than the situation that has surrounded Amy Coney Barrett, who is on, of course, President Trump's short list to replace Anthony Kennedy on the United States Supreme Court. You can read this article in its entirety, which goes on for almost 6 pages, but what I'm going to do is jump down to one of the other criticisms. Of course, we've heard from Senator Dianne Feinstein about her, if you will, Catholic dogma. But then one of the other things that David French talks about is an article that came out and was really concerned that she, that is, Judge Barrett, was part of a group, a tightly knit Christian group that is described as People of Praise. And the fact that this is a small group caused all sorts of people concerns. And in the article, it said legal scholars said that such loyalty oaths could raise legitimate questions about a judicial nominee's independence and impartiality. The scholars said in interviews that while there certainly was no religious test for office, need to make an oath to a group that would wield significant authority over members' lives. And David French, I love what he says here. He says, when I read the article last year, I rolled my eyes so hard I almost injured myself. And he says, the basic facts about the People of Praise small group is, he says, I was amused by the article for a different reason. It betrays fundamental ignorance about the way millions of American Christians live their lives. You see, for many of us, myself included, he says, what happens at church is just the beginning of our efforts to build and sustain a Christian community. And so then on his 4th page, he tells his own personal story. He says, many years ago, before I was married, I belonged to a parachurch organization that enriched my life immeasurably. We prayed together, we worshiped together, we ate meals together, even lived together. He says, my 2 roommates were members of the same group. We often engaged in the same kinds of community outreach. We held each other accountable, and when one member of the group strayed from biblical teaching, the leaders confronted him or her. We spoke the language of covenant, and we've maintained deep relationships to this very day. What was the name of this radical, scary group? He says it was the Harvard Law School Christian Fellowship. And so, again, you can see that there is just this overreaction right now to an individual who is part of a small group, which is probably something you do in your own church. And it's just one more illustration of why we need to pay attention to those issues. So if you haven't had a chance to sign up to pray and to receive some of our emails, we would encourage you to do so. Just before I run out of time, though, I also want to focus on one other issue of concern, and that is the ongoing attempt to abolish ICE. There are some violent actions starting to take place. Today, I guess it was last night, you had vandals throwing a brick through the window of the Republican Party headquarters in Lincoln, Nebraska, and beneath the broken window was spray painted the message, abolish ICE. Well, there are some problems with trying to abolish ICE, and ICE stands for the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Jim Garrity points out one of those, and that is, if you really have a problem with family separation, and I think all of us do at one point or another, blaming ICE is really not even focusing on the right issue, because it's only one agency out of 4 that's playing that issue. He goes through and explains some of that in some detail, but I'll just go to his last paragraph in which he says, basically, you have to understand there's at least 4, and if you count the Defense Department, 5. Because, first of all, you have the U.S. Border Patrol that does the separating. That's issue number 1. Then number 2, you have the Department of Justice that does the prosecuting, because that's actually done under the U.S. Marshals. Then number 3, you have ICE, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, under the umbrella of the Department of Homeland Security, which actually prepares individuals for deportation. And then number 4, you have the Department of Health and Human Services with the Office of Refugee Resettlement that takes care of the children while the adults are being detained or when there aren't any adults present. So the point is there are 4 different organizations in the federal government, 5 if you count the Department of Defense right now, to building tents at Fort Bliss and at Goodfellow Air Force Base in Texas to temporarily house migrants. So to say that we need to abolish ICE is to miss a great deal. When we come back, though, we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Recently, we discussed the Supreme Court's decision in Trinity Lutheran versus Comer. Chief Justice Roberts declared it odious to the Constitution for the state to prevent a church from participating in a public benefit merely because of its religious status. The newest member of the court, Justice Neil Gorsuch, felt compelled to qualify his endorsement of the majority opinion. In his concurring opinion, Justice Gorsuch suggests removing the false distinction between religious status and religious use. As an example, he asks, quote, does a religious man say grace before dinner, or does a man begin his meal in a religious manner, unquote. The same facts could be described in the same way, but under the court's decision, only one is protected. Justice Gorsuch reveals that he believes that the First Amendment protects more than religious status when he writes, quote, neither do I see why the First Amendment's free exercise should care, unquote. Whether status or use, the point of the First Amendment is to protect religious exercise. He says, quote, I don't see why it should matter whether we describe that benefit, say, as closed to Lutherans, status, or closed to people who do Lutheran things, use. It is free exercise either way, unquote. It's good to see the newest member of the court thinking so clearly. The First Amendment should protect the free exercise of religion, regardless of status or use. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and again, we wish you a happy 4th of July, and I'll have some comments about that in just a minute. But let me finish my point, because, again, this is an article that I think would be helpful to you, and you will find some of these resources on the website, and others certainly do a Google search and find them. But, again, we're hearing more and more about this idea of abolish ICE. And, of course, even this brick thrown through a window illustrates that only so well. But I thought it was interesting because there's some people trying to tamp this down a little bit. And one of those is an attorney, Raul Reyes, I should say, in which he says, well, no one is really calling for a halt to immigration enforcement. Either ICE needs to do it in a more humane way with greater oversight, or the agency should be dismantled and its functions reassigned to other agencies. But I love what Jim Garrity says. I've noticed that liberal protesters aren't chanting reform ICE, reform ICE. They're chanting abolish ICE. They're not chanting reassign the duties to other agencies, reassign the duties to other agencies. Instead, they're actually wanting to abolish ICE. And if you look around the country right now, I mentioned the vandals throwing a brick through the Republican headquarters. Let me just give you a brief overview of just a few. And again, these are from news stories. San Francisco, California, quote, demonstrators pitched 5 tents and a small pavilion and a section of chain link fence with barbed wire outside the San Francisco U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services offices last night. Portland, Oregon, quote, a U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement spokeswoman said the agency's Portland headquarters will resume normal operations today. The office was closed on June 20th after protesters upset with the immigration policies blocked entrance. Whether or not they decided to block them again today. Let's go to the East Coast. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, establishing a small encampment for a prolonged occupation. Several hundred protesters gathered late Monday afternoon, that's yesterday, outside the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Office in Center City to demand an end to the agency's policies and cooperation between the city of Philadelphia and ICE. Protesters were there this morning. And just one more, just to illustrate the point, Hartford, Connecticut. Nearly 500 people participated in the protest, including clergy and American Civil Liberties Union observers, in an act of civil disobedience. Some protesters tried to shut down an ICE office on Main Street for the day by blocking the entrance. Last time I had a report, Hartford Police Department said 35 people were arrested. So this could escalate into some kind of violence pretty quickly, which I'll have something to say about in just a minute. But again, if you think that this is a winning issue, one of the other things that I found so interesting is the Huffington Post actually did a survey. Now, let's recognize the Huffington Post has probably a bias towards those individuals that are engaged in civil disobedience, a bias against Donald Trump. So, again, it's not necessarily a Gallup poll or a Rasmussen poll, but we'll take it where it is. But even in their poll, they found that just 21% of respondents said that they supported abolishing ICE, while 44% said they opposed it. And interestingly enough, about 35% undecided. But of those 44%, about 3 in 10 polled that they strongly oppose the idea. So I'm not convinced that this is necessarily a winning issue for them. And as I mentioned in the a couple hours ago, but you probably had not had a chance to hear that, there is now legislation being drafted by one prominent Democrat in the House of Representatives to actually abolish ICE. But it really doesn't abolish ICE. What it does is set up a commission to run ICE, the branch. And there's just a real problem with that. It's called the Constitution, because you cannot have the executive branch agency run by someone other than executive branch leadership. So we'll see that that will go absolutely nowhere. But it illustrates, again, the point. And while we're talking about immigration, I think it's important to mention that the recent election of the new president in Mexico, if anything, does not bode well for border security. Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador is the newly elected president who will take office very soon, although he made some of the obvious comments and assurances about being respectful and having a cooperative relationship with the United States. That's really unlikely. Individuals that know him, have followed him, especially some of the Hispanic American broadcasters who I've been following lately, say that he's more a leftist in the mold of Venezuelan Hugo Chavez, and has already talked about the fact that he thinks that allowing individuals from Central America or even from his own country of Mexico to actually come to the U.S. border is a human right, which he wants to facilitate. Suggests to me that if there's ever been an argument for the need for either a physical wall or a virtual fence, it is the case. And all these protests right now, if anything, are sending a signal to those in Latin America that if you want to make your way to the United States right now, there's so much protesting against ICE that this might be the best time to head for the border and see if you can make it into this country, or to get, quote, accidentally overstay your visa. And, of course, the biggest question that a lot of people have is, are we headed towards some kind of violence? Dennis Prager put out a piece that came out today. If we're Nazis, expect more violence, because he says the American left has put themselves in a moral quandary. Either it doesn't mean it when it calls the president and his supporters Nazis. In this case, he says they're guilty of cheapening and maybe even actually denying the Holocaust. Or else they do mean it, in which case morality demands that they take violent action against Trump supporters, and then gives a whole lot of illustrations. A Senate intern shouting an obscenity on the president in the halls of Congress and not fired. Left-wing mobs yelling "No justice, no sleep" in front of homes of administration. And, of course, the most famous comment by Democratic Congresswoman Maxine Waters: let's make sure we show up wherever we have to show up, and if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and create a crowd, and you push back on them and tell them you're not welcome and they're not welcome anymore anywhere. And so the concern that we have is when you start having people say, wait a minute, desperate circumstances demand desperate actions, it could be really dangerous. So that's something we're going to be paying attention to over the next couple of weeks. Let's, if we can, also end on the fact that sometimes fake news has its consequences. I reported earlier about this reporter that actually finally had to resign because he sent out a Twitter tweet that claimed that the gunman who opened fire in the newsroom there in Maryland was actually wearing a Make America Great hat. And he said, folks, my 21-year career as a journalist, a fancy term that makes my skin crawl, frankly, came to a screeching halt yesterday with one stupid, regrettable tweet. Can't take it back, wish I could. My sincere policies to all good working reporters and to supporters of the president. And, of course, you even have the Iranian Republic right now, as well as one prominent Democrat, claiming that Jews are actually controlling the weather. That came out from the Islamic Republic of Iran, accusing the Jewish state of Israel of cloud and snow theft. You cannot make this stuff up. And blame them for they had snow in March. So there's a real need for some sanity right now in some of these places. But I hope, if nothing else, as we go to the 4th of July, you will enjoy those parades and celebrations. And it has been interesting to see how some studies have said that this may be the best time for us to celebrate America. So I hope that you will do so. Tomorrow will be a tape, and then you'll have a chance to hear the program through the rest of the week. I want to thank Andrew, Stephanie, and Tina for their help behind the scenes. Enjoy the 4th of July. See you back here on Thursday.
Why does Kerby Anderson do what he does? Because he believes in God's ability to use you to make a difference.
There's a real need for us to articulate a responsible biblical perspective and to give people an understanding of what is happening in the world, and in addition to educating them, to then empower them to go out and make a difference for Christ.
Together we can push back the growing darkness. It's not going to be easy, but by God's grace, it is happening one person, one community at a time. Join us in this mission. Become a monthly partner. $1 a day, $30 a month will make a huge difference. Or perhaps you can do $100 a month. We need partners of all sizes. We need you. Give today online at pointofview.net. At the top of the page, next to the Donate Now button, click on Become a Monthly Partner. Pointofview.net. Mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.